Eisenhower emerged from Connor's mentorship more confident in his perspectives and abilities and prepared to excel more than ever before. After returning to Camp Meade in 1924, Eisenhower, thanks partly to General Connor's influence, was admitted to the Command and General Staff School at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, where he studied Army tactics and operations and the problem-solving involved in managing them. Completion of General Staff School was necessary to rise in the Army ranks, and the curriculum was notoriously grueling. No longer simply an average student, in 1926, Ike graduated first in a class of 275. Connor intervened once again in 1927 to have Eisenhower assigned to the American Battle Monuments Commission in Washington, D.C., where he was tasked by General Pershing with writing a narrative history of the American Expeditionary Forces service in Belgium and France during World War I. Later that year, he was admitted to the Army War College in D.C., where he once again graduated first in his class in 1928. Ike and Mamie spent the next year in France, where Eisenhower was commissioned to tour and produce a guide of the First World War battle sites in France. He was then assigned to the War Department in D.C. and tasked with developing plans and strategies for industrial mobilization should another major war break out. In 1930, he met the newly appointed Army Chief of Staff, Douglas MacArthur, whom he quickly impressed with his intelligence and competence. "This is the best damn officer in the Army," MacArthur once remarked about Eisenhower, and resolved, like General Connor before him, to promote Eisenhower's career. Like Connor, MacArthur believed another war could be on the horizon, and in terms of potential military leaders, Eisenhower was one of the most promising. Ike spent the 1930s working closely with MacArthur. As his assistant in Washington, Eisenhower helped to formulate policy and mobilization strategy for a potential upcoming war, according to MacArthur's vision. And in 1935, he accompanied the general to the Philippines, where MacArthur had been assigned to serve as military advisor to President Manuel Quezon. The Philippines were in a transitional period towards independence, and U.S. authorities were anxious that the region be defended from a potential invasion, which they worried might be launched by the Japanese. Eisenhower spent the next 4 years attempting to operationalize and implement MacArthur's plan for the Philippines' defense, one which required key regions to be reinforced, using a citizen army properly trained to fight, and which could be carried out with limited support and resources from the United States. The task was daunting, and the odds of success seemed bleak, but Eisenhower dutifully pursued his assigned goals and did the best he could under the circumstances. Unfortunately, the Philippines would fall to the Japanese by 1942 anyway. What made Ike's experience in MacArthur's service much more difficult was the political infighting among the Americans stationed there, and the personality clashes with MacArthur. But Ike had come a long way from being the hot-tempered young man spoiling for a fight. He had learned instead to compromise, conciliate, and negotiate. He was also noted for maintaining cordial relations with people he disagreed with, a skill he undoubtedly perfected in MacArthur's service. MacArthur was notorious for his irascible personality, and nearly a decade working with him effectively ruined all but the most professional part of the relationship between the two men. Eisenhower, however, proved to have truly mastered himself by having served so well under MacArthur. Ike's strong suit going forward would be his remarkable ability to deal diplomatically, patiently, and effectively with the many high-ranking Allied leaders and commanders, all of whom had to collaborate if they were to secure victory. And many of the Allied leaders and generals of the Second World War were famously difficult, even intolerable personalities. Churchill, de Gaulle, Stalin, Montgomery, and Patton, to name just a few, were all more than challenging to work with. And while they rarely expressed any unreserved approval of their international compatriots, virtually all had good things to say about Eisenhower, seeing him as infinitely competent, fair-minded, genuine, and trustworthy. By 1939, Ike was more than ready for a change, and he discreetly wrote to friends in Washington to help him find a new posting. He returned to Washington shortly after war was declared between Britain and Germany in September. He spent the next 2 years in multiple postings, both as a staff officer and in the field, advising and assisting in the expansion and mobilization of U.S. forces in preparation for a possible entry into World War II. He was given command of the Third Army and received acclaim and commendations for their successes against the Second Army in the 1941 War Games in Louisiana, after which he was promoted to Brigadier General. Here's a question for you. How would you handle working under a boss with a notoriously difficult personality, like MacArthur? Eisenhower did it for nearly a decade. Let me know your thoughts in the comments on how you would navigate such a challenging work environment. 5 days after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Secretary of War, General George Marshall, summoned Eisenhower to Washington and appointed him to head the War Plans Division, eventually giving him command of all U.S. forces in the European theater. It is possible that Ike had been shuffled around in so many different postings in the 2 years leading to U.S. entry into the war, because his performance in various roles was being carefully watched. Apparently, Marshall had decided that Ike was most valuable for his ability to plan, organize, and facilitate the execution of effective military policy and maneuvers. As Secretary of War, Marshall could not afford to promote men who would need to be micromanaged. Marshall needed eminently competent, responsible, accountable generals to whom he could delegate charge of the various large-scale operations and who could act confidently and independently in the moment when necessary. With his 2+ decades of experience, Eisenhower fitted the bill perfectly, yet he now had a greater task before him than he had ever faced, and with little notion of just how great his challenges would be by the last months of the European theater, Eisenhower departed for London in June of 1942. Ike arrived in England with his work cut out for him. Not only nationalistic rivalry, but also unease and distrust clouded the interactions between the Allied military and political leaders. This made planning and cooperation challenging, but communicating effectively with prickly personalities and encouraging many conflicting elements to work together was Eisenhower's strong suit. He was given command of the Allied invasion of North Africa, launched in November of 1942. Accompanying Ike to North Africa was a pretty 33-year-old Irish divorcee named Kay Summersby. She had been assigned to Eisenhower as a driver after his arrival in London, and she remained with him as his personal secretary for the duration of the war. The nature of the relationship between Eisenhower and Summersby has been the subject of much historical controversy and debate. Away from the front, World War II was a very flirtatious time, and numerous members of the American military, both young privates and great generals, formed romantic relationships with British women. Ike and Kay clearly liked each other a great deal, but the exact nature of their relationship has never been fully clarified. Rumors abounded that they were having an affair and that Eisenhower would seek a divorce. However, Ike gave no sign of any such thing in the more than 300 letters he wrote to his wife, Mamie, while he was overseas. After Eisenhower's death, Kay published a memoir in which it was claimed that while there was a romance between them, they had never slept together. Whatever the truth of their relationship, Ike cut ties with Kay when the war was over, returning home to his wife and son. Eisenhower's first major challenge in the Second World War was the North African theater, and while the operation was ultimately a success, it was also plagued by missed opportunities, logistics problems, and painful mistakes. Ike ruefully observed that students at the General Staff College in Washington would be criticizing American performance in North Africa for decades to come. However, the general learned important lessons during the campaign, which he would carry forward with him through subsequent challenges. Operation Torch was the largest amphibious invasion in military history up until that time, and pitted General Eisenhower against the Desert Fox, General Erwin Rommel. Rommel's forces had been struggling against the British Eighth Army led by General Montgomery in the Western Desert Campaign. The Allies took 3 key ports on the northwest coast, Oran, Casablanca, and Algiers, before proceeding east toward Tunisia. The Eighth Army in turn marched west, and by May 1943, the Tunisian campaign ended with the surrender of the Axis forces. Most were of the opinion that the North African theater of operations had continued for much longer than it should have. Eisenhower had been too cautious to proceed on multiple occasions, and had not dealt decisively enough with personnel issues or supply problems. Although the Allies took over 250,000 German prisoners of war and were left in command of the field, Rommel and the bulk of his German forces had escaped. Eisenhower would confront the Desert Fox again, next time on the Western Front. One of Ike's greatest strengths was his ability to learn from his mistakes. Going forward, he resolved to act more decisively and to fine-tune all logistical and personnel relationships. He got tougher on himself as well as on the men serving under him, who nonetheless thought highly of him. Ike was not the inspirational sort of general. Many of the most admired generals were highly charismatic, temperamental men who inspired gut-level loyalty for their abilities, but often had near-intolerable personalities and diva-like attitudes. Eisenhower had famously had to interfere in a disciplinary scandal to keep the near-indispensable Patton from a court-martial after the abrasive general, disgusted at their shows of emotion, had physically assaulted 2 shell-shocked soldiers. Ike was not a fiery, charismatic sort, but he was admired for being plain-spoken, respectful, compassionate, honest, and genuine. While some soldiers might have dreamed of being commanded by a larger-than-life hero general, most soldiers thought of Eisenhower as being approachable, relatable, and fundamentally decent. By the end of the war, he was able to inspire his troops not only through his moral integrity, but also by projecting confidence and trust. The next challenge was the campaign in Italy, starting with the Allied invasion of Sicily in July of 1943. Operation Husky led to the toppling of the Italian fascist dictator Benito Mussolini and the country's surrender. The campaign then moved to the Italian mainland and carried on through 1944. Italy was an exceptionally challenging theater of war, and progress was slow, with repeated breakthroughs and setbacks. As ever, Ike was an excellent organizer and coordinator. He had learned to strike a balance between military and political considerations in his planning, strategy, and communications. It had been a daunting challenge to bring together the American, British, and Free French forces in North Africa, but his success there prepared him for the far larger challenge of building up the Allied presence in the European theater. Ike earned the confidence and respect of Allied political leaders who would rely on him to plan the invasion of France. The North African and Italian campaigns were regarded as complex and, overall, successful. As such, Eisenhower was promoted to Supreme Allied Commander Europe. Ike was now responsible for the Allied effort to retake German-occupied France and was given charge of the planning and coordination for Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion in history and the pivotal point in the European theater. Much of the success of Operation Overlord was due to Ike's exceptionally careful planning and his management and leadership skills. One of his most brilliant feats was the incredible secrecy and deception carried out prior to the invasion. The German forces were led to believe that the Allied invasion would land at the Pas de Calais, rather than at Normandy. The day of the invasion, June 6, 1944, was subject to a considerable number of delays due to the uncertainty of the weather, a major factor in an amphibious landing. Eisenhower was not only responsible for coordinating the vast and complex logistical and operational plans of the landings, but he also had to make the critical decision of whether or not to proceed. On the evening of June 5th, after much discussion with his subordinates, Ike decided to proceed with the invasion. He then sat down to write 2 letters, one of which would be sent to his superiors in Washington in the event the invasion failed, taking full responsibility for the disastrous outcome. Fortunately, the invasion was ultimately a success, and by the end of June, the Allies had taken Cherbourg and Caen and were pushing deeper into France. Consider this. If you had to plan the largest amphibious invasion in history, what would be your first step? Eisenhower faced this exact challenge with Operation Overlord. Reflect on it and share your strategies in the comments. The Allies were dealt a major setback during the Battle of the Bulge. At that time, it was the costliest battle in terms of casualties that American forces had ever fought. The German forces launched a counter-offensive through the Ardennes forest in December of 1944, and Allied forces took the brunt of the assault. Thanks to fierce resistance from the defenders of the critical Belgian town of Bastogne, as well as to the resolve of Eisenhower and his generals, the Germans were defeated by January of 1945. In May, the Nazis formally surrendered to the Allies, and the war in Europe was won. Much of the success of the European theater campaign could be attributed to the general whom everyone liked, trusted, and relied on. Ike returned to the United States in triumph and spent the next few years continuing to serve in the military as Chief of Staff of the Army. He spent some time in retirement after that, working on his memoirs, then briefly returned to service as NATO's first Supreme Commander in 1951. He was eventually convinced to return to public life and run for president. His amiable, approachable personality and reputation for honesty and integrity made him one of the most popular presidents of the 20th century. He led the country through the height of the Cold War, always taking care to strike a balance between diplomacy and the strategic use of military force, and to ensure he left the office and the country in better shape than he had found it. Ike passed away in 1969, greatly beloved by his country and remembered for his affability, patience, and pragmatic optimism. While Eisenhower lacked some of the personal flamboyance or charisma of some of his contemporary generals and political leaders, it is possible that this was part of what made him so effective. His firm, trustworthy, amiable character made people want to rely on him, and his gentle, diplomatic approach to command allowed him to handle complex conflicts and difficult personalities with ease. The end result was that his unpretentious genuineness and honesty made him easy to trust, like, and respect, and it left people with the confidence that everything was in good hands and would work out well. Want to uncover the secrets behind one of America's most iconic presidents? Dive into the life and legacy of John F. Kennedy in our next video. From his groundbreaking leadership to the challenges that defined an era, we'll explore it all. Don't miss out. Subscribe and hit the bell to join us on this journey through history.